What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about some players that you should be picking up off of the waiver wire as we head into week 7 of the fantasy football season. It's not the greatest waiver wire run, not some of the good high-end type of players that we've had in weeks past, but there's still some gems that you can pick up and stash on those rosters. So without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these waiver wire pickups. So before we fully get into the top 10 guys that I would target on my waiver wires, I did want to provide you guys with some double check players that are rostered in over 50% of leagues at the moment that I think are still worth checking on. You have guys like Cole Kmet, Josh Downs, Kirk Cousins, Justin Fields, Caleb Williams, Tyler Lockett, Keon Coleman, Alexander Madison, Antonio Gibson, Tyrone Tracy Jr., Braylon Allen, Romeo Doubs, and Jalen Tolbert. A lot of those guys have been talked about on previous episodes over the last couple of weeks, but if they are available in your leagues, you should be targeting those players as well. But let's talk about the guys that are under 50% that are going to be available in the majority of fantasy football leagues. And the first guy I want to talk about in today's episode is Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers. Now, he is rostered in about 42% of fantasy football leagues, and that number kind of surprised me. Now, I get it because Christian Watson, he did suffer an ankle injury in week 4 versus the Minnesota Vikings that was rumored to be a multi-week injury. Now, at the time, that's obviously why we made Dontayvion Wicks a priority pickup. A lot of the fantasy football community really liked Dontayvion Wicks, and that's why he was a very popular waiver wire ad. Well, Watson, he only missed week 5's matchup against the Rams before becoming a surprise active in week 6 versus the Arizona Cardinals, and that type of panic on Watson and the hype on Wicks has caused Watson to be dropped in a lot of leagues, and he's still available to add on waivers in nearly 58% of your fantasy football leagues at the current moment. Now, Watson, he caught 3 of his 4 targets for 68 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's win, and he posted his highest yardage total of the season so far. He is one of Jordan Love's favorite red zone targets in a high-scoring offense, and because of that, mixed with the fact that this week's waiver wire run is a pretty weak waiver wire overall, Watson, he's going to be a priority pickup for me in this week's waiver cycle if he is available in your league. Now, moving on to my second guy, I want to talk about Ty Chandler. He's rostered in 35% of leagues at the moment. And we talked about Ty Chandler on last week's episode, and I mentioned how he was simply just not being talked about enough with the injury to Aaron Jones, and that he would be a sneaky add to rosters last week due to the Vikings going on bye there in week 6. Well, since that video, there really hasn't been much news on Aaron Jones outside of the fact that the Vikings have had him listed as week to week with the injury, meaning that there is a decent chance that Ty Chandler could be the starter this week versus the Detroit Lions if Jones isn't 100% healthy come Sunday. So that said, I would be picking up Ty Chandler this week as one of the top running back ads and following the practice reports throughout the week, because if Jones were to miss this week or maybe even 1 or 2 more weeks with this injury, there are some good matchups on the horizon here for the Minnesota Vikings. They got Jacksonville and Indianapolis over the next 2 weeks after Detroit that could end up being great starts for Ty Chandler in Jones's absence if he were to miss some additional time. Now let's talk about a wide receiver. I want to talk about JuJu Smith-Schuster. He's rostered in about 33% of leagues at the moment, and JuJu's another player we talked about briefly last week as somebody that you could stash through the bye week. But in week 5, when JuJu was asked to fill in for the injured Rashee Rice, he posted a stat line of 7 catches for 130 receiving yards, and he finished as a low-end wide receiver 1 on the week. Now, I don't necessarily expect low-end wide receiver 1 numbers from JuJu Smith-Schuster on a week-by-week basis, but they had him playing in the slot the same way Rice had been to start this year, producing some solid results there in his absence. JuJu probably should have been picked up and stashed last week, but if for some reason he's still on the waiver wire in your leagues, I would be picking him up to see if he can create some of the same magic that he made there in week 5 here this week in a matchup against the San Francisco 49ers. Now let's talk a little bit about Tyler Allgeier of the Atlanta Falcons. He's rostered in about 40% of leagues. Tyler Allgeier, he's been talked about a lot by the fantasy football community over the last few weeks, and we said that you should pick him up last week due to the matchup and the snap count increases that we had been seeing over the last previous weeks, but I don't think anybody expected Tyler Allgeier to finish as a top 5 running back in week 6 versus the Carolina Panthers. Now, it's very clear that Allgeier, he is a key part of this run game, and even though Bijan Robinson is still the lead back and he had 2 touchdowns in this week's matchup, Allgeier has standalone value and he is a premium handcuff in the fantasy football world. If anything were to happen to Bijan Robinson, Allgeier could provide us with some RB1 weeks in fantasy, especially considering that he has some decent matchups over the next few weeks against Seattle, Tampa Bay, Dallas, who's been giving up a lot of points to the running backs, and New Orleans. So there's no reason why Allgeier should remain on waiver wires after this week's run. Now let's go on to another player that I felt like was a little surprising to be available in over 50% of your leagues. It's going to be Tua Tagovailoa for the Miami Dolphins. Now he's rostered in 45% of leagues according to Sleeper. Tua's been out of the lineup for the Dolphins since suffering a concussion in week 2 of the season against the Buffalo Bills, and that extended absence plus the uncertainty of Tua Tagovailoa has caused a lot of fantasy football managers to drop him in your fantasy football leagues. Now right now Tua is available in over 55% of leagues, and he's a player that I'd be willing to add and gamble on in this week's waiver cycle. The last time we saw him play, he was the QB9 overall on the week in week 1, and head coach Mike McDaniel said today that the expectation is for Tua to play again here this season. Now Tua is eligible to return to practice on October 23rd, and with the Dolphins needing better quarterback play and the AFC East still being fairly open for the taking, I would be adding Tua to my fantasy football rosters if I had the extra space, because once he's back in your lineup, he can give you those low-end QB1 type of performances on a week-by-week basis. Now let's talk about another quarterback. I want to stay in the AFC East, but we'll talk about rookie quarterback Drake Maye, who is currently rostered in only 15% of leagues. Drake Maye, he was selected number 3 overall in the 2024 NFL Draft for a reason, and I think his first NFL start in week 6 showed us some of the fantasy football upside that he has that's worth gambling on as well. Drake Maye currently ranks as a quarterback 1 on the week after throwing for 243 passing yards and 3 touchdowns in the Patriots' loss to the Texans, and he also rushed the ball 5 times for an additional 38 rushing yards. Maye does enough with his legs to provide a different type of ceiling than most of the waiver wire quarterbacks we've talked about, like Andy Dalton, the Joe Flacco types. He just does a little bit more with his legs, plus he has a really good matchup this week versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, who currently rank dead last against opposing quarterbacks when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the position. I think Maye is a must-add and stash here this week versus Jacksonville, and if you have a Dak Prescott or a Caleb Williams who is going to be on bye this week, I think you can even stream Maye here in this matchup and plug him into the starting lineup. Now let's talk about another guy you can stash. It's going to be Kimani Vidal for the Los Angeles Chargers. He is rostered in about 16% of leagues, and Vidal is a player who intrigues me on this week's waiver wire, and honestly, I was trying to stash him onto my benches in a few places as we went into the weekend last week where I could afford to use the roster spot. Now I will admit Vidal, he is a risky ad, and we can get that out of the way first, but he is a home run swing at the running back position, and in week 6 he only played 24% of the snaps for the Chargers, but he still finished as a running back 2 in fantasy due to a receiving touchdown. Now Vidal, he is a high upside stash for me because even though this is still J.K. Dobbins' backfield to bell cow, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, with Gus Edwards now on IR and Vidal making the most of his limited touches this week, I could see the Chargers giving him a little bit more work, and the only thing standing between him and a massive workload is the often injured legs of J.K. Dobbins, so because of that, he is a very high upside stash just in case if you have the bench space. Now let's talk about Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren is being rostered in 42% of leagues at the moment, and Warren was a player that many people were excited about during the draft season due to his efficiency as a change of pace back to Najee Harris in an often run-heavy offense here in Pittsburgh. However, an early season hamstring injury has kind of derailed the start of the year for Warren, and as a result, caused a lot of fantasy football managers to drop Warren for other options over the last couple of weeks as well. Warren did rejoin the Steelers lineup here in week 6 to again become the change of pace guy to Najee Harris, and even though he was very inefficient with his touches this week, I don't mind fantasy football managers picking him up where he was dropped and putting him back on their teams if they're looking for some running back help on a week that really does lack those high-end waiver wire options. Now my second to last guy we'll talk about is Isaac Guerendo of the San Francisco 49ers. He is rostered in only 5% of leagues at the moment, and Isaac Guerendo makes the list this week due to a Jordan Mason injury that was a shoulder injury in last week's matchup against the Seattle Seahawks. Now although it isn't guaranteed that Mason misses any time at all, Guerendo did look like the next guy up in this Niners offense, and he rushed 10 times for 99 yards with a long rush at the end of the game of 76 yards to finish it off. That said, I would not be spending a ton of my fab or burning a waiver wire priority on Guerendo because, as I mentioned, there's still a decent chance that Jordan Mason does play this week and he doesn't miss any time at all. So maybe this pickup is just more for the Jordan Mason manager as an insurance option. However, even if you do pick up Guerendo, this week's matchup is horrible against the Kansas City Chiefs. They are the #1 run defense in the NFL against the fantasy football running back position. So just keep that in mind when you are thinking about Isaac Guerendo, or if you had Jordan Mason and needing the backup to fill in for him here this week. And now my last and final player we'll talk about is Rashod Bateman of the Baltimore Ravens. He's rostered in 17% of leagues, and Bateman, he is one of the few decent options to pick up at the wide receiver position this week if you're looking for a wide receiver streamer, because over his last 2 games, he has seen 12 targets and he scored an average of 13.5 PPR points in those games in those 2 matchups. Now, the Ravens are playing really good football at the moment, and Bateman, he's done very well playing as the wide receiver 2 option opposite of Zay Flowers this year, and he has solid streaming potential here in this week's matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who currently rank 27th against the wide receiver position. Now, as I mentioned before, this week's options at the wide receiver position aren't great overall, and there really aren't a lot of high-end waiver wire pickups, so if you are just looking for a plug-and-play 1-week type of stream, I do think you could do a lot worse than a guy like Rashod Bateman here at the wide receiver position. So there you have it, folks. That is my top 10 waiver wire targets here on Week 7's waiver wire run. As always, if you did enjoy the video, go ahead and hit the like button. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed and make sure you enter our Discord. Our Discord is free to join. It will be linked in the description. As I mentioned, free, so there is no risk in doing that, but you do enter a community with a ton of dope people that want to help you with your fantasy football teams. So if you just want to talk some ball, hang out, maybe even get some advice from me anytime, 24/7, 365, go join that Discord. It is free to join, linked in the description. And with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next one. But until then, peace out.